Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of the Reverse Mental Lab podcast. You're back with your hosts, Josh and Jens.
The Reverse Mental Lab podcast is a podcast which is around generational learning, where the leaders of today learn from the leaders of tomorrow. Josh, whom do we talk with today?
I'm glad you asked, Jens, and we've had some fascinating conversations on the podcast so far. And today we've got a guest lined up. Her name is Eleanor Saunders. And in this episode, we'll chat to Eleanor, and it's a wide-ranging discussion, exploring Eleanor's story, her thinking around new educational models, and climate hackathons. Eleanor has been in the education space for over 15 years, cutting across both formal and information education. She has designed programs including the world's largest climate hackathon, Europe's main systems innovation summer school, and innovation training for Global South international funding. She specializes in interactive participation-driven learning, drawing on techniques from teaching, coaching, mentoring, and peer learning within the fields of innovation and sustainability. We hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome back to another episode of the Reverse Mental Lab. Eleanor, it's great to have you with us today. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm really good. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Jens and Josh.
Hello. Great to have you.
Yeah, connecting from different corners of the world as usual, and thanks to this digital interface and digital world that we now are becoming quite accustomed to navigating. So on the call today, we've got someone sitting in South Africa, which is myself, and then we've got Ireland represented as well, and Jens is in Germany as always. So yeah, a bit of a global conglomeration today. But Eleanor, before we dive into what we've got lined up today to chat about, you maybe just tell us a bit about yourself, share a bit of your story and some of the experience that you've had.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Eleanor Saunders, and I guess my story, like everybody's, is a strange and snaking path. And if you look back through your story, you're always able to say, oh, today I want to tell this piece of it or this piece of it, and you can make some sense out of that. But actually, if you're honest about it, it's just many twists and turns that you take at different points. I work mainly in education, sustainability, and health, which are three massive areas. So, it's hard to even work within one of those, let alone across kind of three of them. But I found that I was passionate when I was a child about disease, which is a cheerful thing to be passionate about as a young person. So I went to study that. As a little kid, I used to draw pictures of germs. Obviously, I was just ramping myself up for this pandemic in the future. I was a very odd child. And so I went and studied that at university, and then I tried to go and do research in it. And I found in doing research that it wasn't my space. So then I went to become a high school teacher because I thought, well, if it's not my space, I want other kids to love germs as much as I love germs. I tried to become a high school teacher, and there I really learned that children learn in fascinating and different ways, and they're just wonderful to work with. But then when we step outside of school, or so many of the influences that kids in school have that come from outside of there are different. They're from this adult world where we're supposed to think differently and behave differently. And I couldn't really understand why that was the case. Why are we doing all these interesting things in school only to leave school and be told you have to operate in a different way? So then I tried to sort of branch out into the world and think about, okay, how can I start playing around in that space of getting adults to work in a more interesting way? How could a meeting be more like a classroom? How could work be more like play? How can people change the way that they're doing things? And then, I became more and more into the space of sustainability because that was kind of rising as a space to be in, as somebody who had a scientific background, even though not in that. It was a space that I could definitely have conversations within. And now I've just really done a huge amount in there of trying to get people to think about climate change, but from many different angles and in many different ways. So it's been an interesting experience. And still, when I come back home, and I sit down and talk to some of my elders, it always reminds me again how differently people approach this. I still come from a space where climate change is not even necessarily really accepted. And I'm sure many people are facing that as well, that you have a variety of interactions happening, and how do you find out who you are and what your path is within that. So yes, that's a little bit in a nutshell of kind of a bit of my journey, some of the things that I've done in there, and kind of where I land and think.
Interesting story. Thanks for sharing. I'm curious. I need to dig deeper into it. Sorry for that. So,
go for it.
What is the main thing you have learned is the difference between young people learning and like people after school in the working environment learning? What is the biggest thing you have seen?
So it depends on when you were a teacher and when you're in a classroom, because of course methodologies and ideas change all the time, and also where in the world you've been in a classroom. This would change hugely to it. But there's an expectation when you're an adult that you can sit and listen and that you want to take on board information. And that expectation is not necessarily there as a child. As a child, if you need to take a break, if you get hungry, you're allowed to yell these things out. And depending on the age you are as a child, you're allowed to do that in slightly different ways. But even right through school, even when you're a teenager, there's sort of an acceptance that you can still be human. But once you're an adult and you're in a professional vocation, a professional situation, if you're sitting through a board meeting and the director of that meeting says, we need to keep going, and you're thinking, I can't, I'm tired, my brain is just out, I can keep going, but I'm not actually being creative, I'm not at the top of my peak. And there are some places where you can, say that, but there's still so many places where you can't. You just have to go, okay, the chair has said we're still going, I'll just sit here quietly and keep going. And I mean, that's a very kind of simple example, but actually it's quite key to how we think about these things, that we don't put our kind of ability to be at our peak of openness, of creativity, and that's what I sort of think of as learning when we're in the workplace as the top priority. We put our professionalism, our ability to look really smart, our ability to be the best at our game, sort of at the top when we're working. And for me, this needs to be changed quite a lot, because actually the people who I see who are the best are the ones who do go, I don't understand. I don't know what's happening right now. I'm too tired to listen to this. I want to move into a different space. And, those people allow things to change, but they're not the norm.
Yeah. I guess there's a lot, sorry, Judge, I'm jumping in because I'm curious. I guess there's a lot of mindset as well needed, mindset shift needed. I mean, you have been talking about the boardrooms, and I've been part of a couple of board meetings, and it felt sometimes they have been designed in a way that they create this pressure to get decisions done. And as well, like you said, this professional, like if you're in a professional meeting, alone that we need to use a professional and a normal, like that we compare, hey, we have a normal meeting and we have a professional meeting. Mm-hmm. So we are distinguishing two types of meetings. One is professional, one is not professional. Doesn't say anything around the content itself. It's just the setting and how it like the perceived feeling of it. It's quite interesting to experience that.
And yet, Jens, when do you make your best decision? Like if you think about the last decision that you made, what conditions were you in when you made it? And were you happy with that decision?
Yeah, for me, it's not always, but often when I do sports, when I do long distance cycling or running, then I get an idea. It's like, oh, I should do that. And then it's kind of, I'm either texting myself to remember it afterwards. But yeah, it's definitely not like the pressure meetings.
Yeah, for me too. I find if I go running, that really helps me to process things, because your eyes are just watching other things, but your mind doesn't really have to tell you how to run. You know how to run, and yeah, it can think away and work things over, and it's a beautiful environment for me, and for other people that needs more people around in order to do that. But yeah, it's never when somebody's standing over you going, "We have 4 minutes left and we've got to make this decision," but still, there's also a process around that, in that if you make decisions in those professional environments, it's then how you act on those decisions too, because a decision is one point in time. But then if you realize it's not the right decision, are you able to say, okay, actually we made the wrong decision in that meeting. Let's change, let's move forward differently. So there's multiple points as well where this openness can kind of come in to just accept the wisdom of how things are moving forward. And that often is also not held on to, that people say, no, we've written down in the minutes that this is going to happen. So this is going to happen. It doesn't matter if it costs 10 million more, we're doing it.
You just promised it to the board. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating when you think about sort of these fixed constraints that we've sort of constructed, and at the end it ties back to what you mentioned around the design of those interactions. And Eleanor, I know that you've got a vast experience in terms of helping people understand different things, whether that's using education, but also things like peer-to-peer learning. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that you mentioned, when you spoke about you running and your mind's not necessarily focusing on running, but it's then connecting different dots, let's say. And if you take that analogy and you say, what is needed then to start thinking about the way that we can construct new education models, and potentially what does that do for the way that we learn and how we should be learning?
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's about creating a lot more space. It's about honoring the spaces within learning. And it's about looking at the change that is happening now in what is needed in terms of knowledge as well. So it used to be that we needed to learn knowledge. And now it is that we need to learn how to synthesize knowledge, because our access to knowledge is so much more open. And this synthesizing process is a different thing to have to learn, and it works in different ways. If you just want people to learn information, then, there's certain kind of tricks for that, which we're quite good at because we've been teaching information for quite a long time. And there's many sort of study hacks to help yourself focus, work in, short sprints, write things down, question yourself before you start reading some information, and it helps your brain to process it better. And they all exist, but sort of hacks for this synthesis of information, they're starting to come out, but they're not so much there. And it's still that it tends to be quite individual, and it tends to sort of sit more in almost a well-being space. How do you make yourself feel at your best or process at your best? And it sort of sits slightly outside of the learning or the professionalism space. So it's about looking at some of these alternative ways of being and really thinking about this question of when do you process information the best, when and how, and starting to kind of bring that into pedagogy, into education, into how people are learning. And people are playing with it a lot. There's definitely a lot of things going on. I mean, one of the biggest shifts that happened is kind of making it user-centric or learner-centric, that the person who is the learner can lead a lot of what is happening. And these sort of methodologies are very nice. You get problem-based learning and challenge-based learning, and you get different pedagogies, like reality pedagogy is an interesting one that kind of came out in America, where you had people who were in gangs and didn't want to go to school because being in the gang is more important. But if you bring sort of their experience of being in the gang into the school, then suddenly they have a forum to talk about that and air it. So then they want to come to school again. So these sort of flips where you're saying, right, actually, if we're talking about synthesis of information, then real life is as important, because real life is where you're constantly getting that knowledge and you have to synthesize from.
Yeah, so I love that example that you gave, Eleanor, is very, very powerful. And my mind starts running when you start exploring different ways to think about pedagogy and the way that we interact with knowledge. And I think the one thing that I want to just double click on and ask you a deeper question is, how and what should we be thinking about when we think about this information synthesis in terms of collaboration? And what role does collaboration play in helping us potentially synthesize this information that we now have so much access to?
Yeah. I mean, this is a fascinating one, and it's one that I'm also really playing with myself. It's a big question that I hold, and I think it still sits very much as a question. So yeah, I certainly don't have an answer to that one, but I can kind of play with it a little bit. And I often think, when I think about education that's worked the best, even traditionally, so even where we had education that was more about getting knowledge, it worked best in formats where people were also brought together and felt like they were communities whilst that was happening. So to take a very kind of standard example, if you look at Oxford or Cambridge in the UK, the way these universities are set up is they're broken into colleges. Each college is like a family. You're brought in, you're constantly mixed with with these other people who are considered to be sort of like you, who are striving in the same way as you. And the whole kind of environment that's set up there is that you don't just go to lectures and then forget about it. You go to lectures and then you come back to your college, you're going to talk to people, you're going to go to dinners with your professors. So you're constantly immersed in this environment where everyone is interested to keep talking about the thing that you're learning about. And I think that there's something quite key in this, and that's why those kind of institutions have sort of excelled and built such a good name for themselves. It's not just about getting in the best people, but it's about interacting those best people along the way. And we're starting to see this quite a lot when we kind of think to other environments as well, that people are often trying to bring in a stimulus. They'll bring in a speaker, but it's not just to talk to people anymore. It is to kind of interact. You get more formats now where you have sort of leadership round tables to have discussions of things. But they still tend to be a little bit fixed in time rather than necessarily the ongoing way in which you work, in which you only really still get in those very special kind of education environments. But there are workspaces that are starting to try and create this a little bit. I mean, even looking back, it's an old example now, but when Google tried to create their more sort of open format that everyone would be able to take more breaks, to sit on beanbags, to hang out, and the sort of Silicon Valley idea of people really working on their startups 24/7 with their group. And you can see there that those people really excelled as well, because again, they had a collaborative environment that was totally focused on something that they really wanted to do. And their goals probably changed along the way. And they may not talk about that. Some of them might not. But yeah, they set up a space where they would really be interacting all the time. Whenever they came back from a run and said, I've had this thought, there's someone to give that thought to immediately. So yeah, it's something around this, but I mean, there's many sort of pinpoints within that. And it doesn't give a direct answer of how we should work, but collaboration is certainly a big part of it. Collaboration, talking to others, feeling safety with the people that you're around, the ability to change and acknowledge that amongst others, the ability to sort of group think and group problem solve, and the ability to sort of celebrate successes and not be upset about failures. Many things in it. It's a big question, Joshua.
But what's quite fascinating for me when you talk about community collaboration and safe space, sometimes it feels like we just need to go 200 years back, where you have been living in small communities very close together. Everyone is taking care of everyone around. And you see it still in parts of the world where this is like the norm, where people are, or as well in different cultures. Like I lived in Russia, where the family culture is way more or closer than, for example, in Germany, just taking these two examples. So in some ways, we as well need to learn to unlearn what we have learned and how we behave today because of the norms we are kind of fitting in. Yeah. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I often look to kind of other cultures and think, gosh, they're doing it better. When you look to places where family units are still more held together, where community is more highly prized. And, it's an interesting one because sometimes if you look to like the Nordics, for example, people are quite individual in the Nordics. And particularly if you go up north, I mean, you'll know this way better than me, Jens. You walk into a bar and people are silent, or in a cafe, people aren't interacting. And there's a high degree of wealth. People are quite comfortable, but yet you also see, acclamation for the education systems coming out of the Nordics. So there you have quite strong individualism, but also still, very strong education that's happening. So things, they don't necessarily have to be all about kind of community and togetherness, but I also am strongly on the sort of belief system that where you look to those communities, you see a lot of richness happening and a lot of interesting things going on. I ran an experiment last year. So with a couple of colleagues, we did an intergenerational conversation where we had 8-year-olds talking to people who were over 70. And we had to do this online. So we did a series of calls, and we talked both to the separate groups first to kind of prep them for this conversation. And the topic was supposed to be climate change, but it turned out that it was much more open than that actually they just wanted to sort of explore one another. But we tried in the first conversations to talk to them about, what did they sort of think about it? What would they bring to this conversation once they met the older or the younger generation? And something that was quite fascinating that came out for me was that the younger generation were really excited to meet the older generation. And we asked them to bring an object that would surprise that person. And they went and they got, fascinating things from around them. And they were like, this is definitely going to surprise an older person. And they were so full of joy about it. Whereas the older group were really nervous about meeting these 8-year-olds, really, really nervous. And they very much kind of held back in the meeting. And then it came out that a lot of the thoughts that were going on was that they were nervous that the 8-year-olds would blame them, that if they were going to talk on the topic of climate change, that they would have a group of 8-year-olds saying, you destroyed our planet, we hate you, we don't want to talk to you. They were also worried that the 8-year-olds might think that they were boring and wouldn't want to talk to them for that reason. And it was just amazing to have been in the other room and know the joy that was waiting for these people, and then to hear kind of their fear. But then if you ask them about their grandchildren, they just, they lit up. Their grandchildren were a group of children that they could interact with, that they understood, that they knew valued them, and they had value to give. And that interaction was something that was beautiful, but new 8-year-olds, terrifying. And I'm just, I'm still trying to unpick from that experiment where my learning was of how do we make it so communities feel more like family and people are just people, that you don't think my grandchild safe, another child, an impossible conversation, because then you do miss out on this wealth of learning. If you only speak within your own community, your own family, then you're missing out on all these other rich inputs that could come in and that you could learn from. Sorry, I think I might have gone off on a bit of a tangent there. I'm unsure. My brain just sort of hit a wall and it went, I don't think you're talking about the right thing, Eleanor. So I'm gonna just stop there.
It's super good. But what's quite interesting about that topic is specifically if you have now said like more from a personal interaction perspective in a private space, though that it was not really private. But if Joshua and I talk a lot about the cultural and generational exchange in companies, that's even less.
Yes.
And we don't know yet if it is fear or what is hindering, if it's like the hierarchy of the organization where most of the time, at least the more experienced people are on top and the younger people are, if you look into hierarchy, are in the lower ranks. If that's like a way that's not helping to interact. Have you any thoughts and experience on that?
Yeah. So this is something that is about sort of a build-up of knowledge as well. And as you get to the top of your business, you have a way of speaking and a way of doing things, and you've built your own culture and language. And when you interact with your own group, they speak in that way. And when you step outside of that group, they don't. And this is often kind of considered lesser or stupid or, unable to kind of process the level that you're at. Whereas actually it's just a language barrier. So often you will have the CEO of a company and they'll talk to their intern, and their intern might have really great ideas, but they're not packaging them in the way that they're used to meeting another CEO, and that CEO will package the idea. And yes, of course, the intern also doesn't have as much experience, but they have totally different experience. And the world is moving so fast now that totally different experience is something that's vital and is something that will help organizations to actually be more robust, be better, live longer. So for me, there has to be a real change in this. And I do see it quite a lot as just this sort of breakdown in conversational barriers, in language barriers, of being able to strip away some of that and saying, right, I can listen to you just for what you're saying, and I can put to the back of my mind how you've packaged it. But, I say that as if it's simple, and it's not. It's incredibly difficult. And if it wasn't incredibly difficult, it would already be happening and we'd all already be interacting in this way. And, there are ways that people are trying to do it. They're trying to kind of have creative functionalities within meetings where you have sort of silent brainstorm sessions where you stick up Post-its on walls or write things down or share things across one another. and then have different spokespeople for what you've said. So things like this can help. But people tend to do it in very pocketed environments. It's like, right, we're going to go into one of those creative storms and we're going to invite the interns in as well. And it's not leaked out of that yet. It's not just, hey, we're having a board meeting and everyone is coming and it's actually valuable. There's still this feeling of we're having a board meeting and it needs to be one of those professional meetings you mentioned before, Jens. So we're only going to invite the top 5 and we're going to make some decisions today. And it's partly also because those processes take time. So people are still, when they're experiencing them, if you have a conversation and really get information out of somebody, then give them a different spokesperson to package that and they can bring it to a CEO. This is such a long process, and it would enable information flows, but people are not ready and willing to do it because they're too busy getting their job done. And the intern is too busy trying to look smart and trying to look like they're doing really well to just be able to stop and say, but I do think I have some good ideas. And if we could find a way to package those so they can get to the right people, then this would be really nice. But that's usually not their role. And the few interns who kind of manage to do it either excel really well or are told that they're stepping out of line and are a bit annoying and need to quieten themselves down. And here, when we start to talk about cultural boundaries as well, there's also a huge problem here in terms of the type of intern who will be allowed to speak up and the type of intern who won't. And I mean, those are not only generational, they're racial, they're cultural, they're, in terms of, like, if you have a learning disability, if you phrase things very differently. So there's huge barriers there for some people, much, much more so than others. And that should be acknowledged.
So I love that, and those are great points, Eleanor. And I want to just double back onto what you meant, 2 areas that you mentioned. The first is around community, and then what you just mentioned now about information transfers and flows, and sort of tie that into this concept that I know that you've organized some of the world's biggest hackathons, and specifically climate hackathons. And say, if we take that notion of a hackathon, how do we create that information flow to extend outside of that immediate setting? And maybe you can share some thoughts and ideas around how people could think about doing that so that you can create more ways for information to flow outside of just that immediate environment that you set up that hackathon or you set up that creative function inside a meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what it's all about. There are shifts and points in time in kind of what is needed. And climate has now moved on as a conversation piece, and it is more about taking things forward. Absolutely. There was a point in time where still it just needed to be aired. There needed to be events. So people said, oh, climate, actually a thing. We should talk about this. But they weren't ready enough to do that in more than a small bite-sized chunk. And when we talk about things like climate hackathons, so yes, I've been quite involved. One of the largest hackathons that runs the Climathon. It's running in hundreds of different cities, and it's a very exciting little interaction. It's 24 hours. You bring together city officials with people from that city, and they hack the climate problems that those city officials are facing. And kind of some of the longevity of that is that you've brought those two groups together. So the city officials are hearing what's coming out of that hack. But the challenge around it is if you have something global that's happening that you say, it's 24 hours, we're going to have a high media buzz around this, then that is exactly as you say, Josh, it's an event. It's one of these little creative points where you get an interaction, but it doesn't necessarily have any spillover. And in that way, I often think that hackathons in that sense are dated already, that they had a purpose to highlight things, and now that's past. And 24 hours is not long enough to do anything in a real challenge area. 24 hours is long enough for what hacks were originally designed for, which was a group of people coming together who wanted to write a bit of code. And they were like, right, we're not getting this bit of code written. Let's just stay in this room until it's written. And, it really works well there. But solving a huge problem like climate change, but also if you look to things like immigration, poverty, any of these world challenges that we face, 24 hours is absolutely not enough. So you've got to have start points, and one could talk about that as something like a hackathon. And if it's media friendly, then maybe you can get monetary flows to it. And, in this sense, we were able to, cities can get a small amount of funding in order to set that up. So that's good. That's sort of a touch point. But people do need buy-in, and to get that buy-in, you have to have built a strong foundation that what you're doing is not just a media exercise, it's something that's useful. So you have to have quite a lot of collaborative talks leading up to the event itself. Then you would bring these people in, and then they have to feel valued at the event and like there is purpose and opportunity afterwards. And to hold that space, again, so if we use just this example, we have city officials would need to be making space to have those continued conversations, because the public can very easily be put off. If you go and throw in your idea and then you don't see it happening fast, you feel let down. And I mean, not just in this situation, in any situation. But if you're still kind of brought back in and you're shown the changes that thinking is going through and you're allowed to continue to contribute to it, then that's very exciting. And this could be a public forum that I'm talking about. This could be a professional forum that I'm talking about. But it's no good if you ever just take ideas from people at one stage and then even have something where you say, right, I'm always open for you to come and talk to me. Not enough. You have to really build in a process where you are actively going to keep talking so everyone knows what's happening to that information and everyone feels ownership. Again, incredibly hard to set up.
Yeah, and I think that's it's similar way of thinking, at least from my experience in companies needed.
Yeah.
It's like one I've heard it so often, like the CEO and the executive management and the board is saying, like, we have an open door policy. You are always welcome to, there's an alarm, Joshua. So you're always welcome to come to my office and talk to me. But then how often is that really happening if you're not showing it to others that it's possible? And like you said, it's like creating like possibilities over time where this is possible, not just, hey, there's an open door. But if you take an intern, which intern would go into the CEO's office, depending where the office is and so on. But I think
and if the CEO has changed what they're talking about, so maybe they're even using the intern's idea, but now they've repackaged it in CEO language. Yeah. Then even if the intern comes and speaks about it, they don't realize they're still talking about the same thing.
Yeah. And I think that there's also part of this transparency that not many CEOs are saying, hey, I got this idea from that intern or from an intern, and that's how it started. So that's how it's going. So that people see, oh, I can maybe give my idea to the CEO as well, and he might be taking it. Not every idea will be taken, but at least showing the transparency. Hey, I got like 5 good ideas and I merged them together into something. Yeah.
So there's an honesty in there as well. And I mentioned safe space before as well, but honesty is huge. And there's too much hierarchy and needing to strive and seem successful. And too much of that successfulness is kind of based around the fact that you did it yourself. And actually, if we're honest, we never do it ourselves. And if you look back through any of your lives, you've done it as a collaboration. Pretty much nobody has had a completely original idea entirely on their own that they've then taken through with never speaking to anybody to create something that is excellent and a huge change. This just doesn't exist when we're honest about things. But yet that is the pinnacle of what we say is great leadership, is somebody who is a role model, is someone who is just this thought leader that did it all by themselves. And they're not there. It's a lie.
Yeah. And it's at least my experience is quite a lot of like, hey, my personal brand is I'm the big guy. I'm the CEO. I'm whoever or at least I'm the perceived. That's most of the time that I'm the perceived high ranking person. And in the end, if you then see them in a private setting, hey, this is a normal person. They can be normal human as well. But even in professional networks where we are meeting and are in, you see that as well. A lot of people are just putting like a facade up that say, I'm a very successful entrepreneur, I'm a successful CEO, and like, I'm not reachable from anyone. And that, of course, then hinders younger generations or other people who are feeling a bit turned off by that and interacting with that person, giving good ideas, whatever. And I think that's this honesty and trust is really something we as a society need to work on, in my eyes.
And it is as a society, because also everybody has to make that change. So it's not just that a CEO has to suddenly change and be more open and honest. The parents of that CEO need to still see them as successful if they change their way of working. And equally, the younger people who are coming in still need to see that CEO as successful. And I think that shift is happening on that side, because younger people and the way that sort of social media is used in the younger generations as well, there is this more openness and honesty coming out in some spaces, not everywhere. But I mean, it certainly used to be, and even still a decade ago, if you were an intern somewhere and the CEO was this sort of a soft person who constantly came around and asked people questions, people would sort of go, yeah, they're not really getting the job done. And, so that shift has to happen everywhere, because that person who is a leader, and so many people are leaders in so many different ways, but they still have to feel comfortable that they are a leader. And there's so many different ways to create that comfort and show that respect. And it doesn't just have to be about sort of sitting on a pedestal, but it does have to come from all levels. If they're constantly being told you're doing this wrong because they're trying something new, you're losing your interns, your elders don't want to talk to you, your board are now dropping out because they think you're crazy, then you're going to be shrinking back to going, okay, I need to be the traditional leader again. So it's very hard. There's a lot to battle against. So yeah, it's certainly not just CEOs who have to change. It is society. Yeah.
And it's also having a conversation around what is success. Understanding that is a key point as well. But sorry, Josh, we're disrupted by alarms today.
Yes, well, we're over time, right?
Only Eleanor, you're missing to have an alarm in your end.
Yeah, right. I'll set one off.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, Eleanor, and there's so much that we've covered today, and I'm also just conscious on what are we asking and how are we asking and interacting with people. And I think what you mentioned right at the end around levels, and we're definitely going to have to see how we can explore that further with you, whether it's in a live setting or another podcast potentially, because I think that's something that in itself as a concept deserves a space, because that's extremely different in terms of how, and difficult to navigate those different levels overall. So as we sort of shared before we started recording, we set up this challenge, or this notion of a challenge or point of inspiration that we'd like our guests to leave with listeners of the podcast. So I'm going to hand the microphone back to you and ask, what do you have lined up for the listeners today?
Yeah. Well, what I had lined up was different, but actually now as we've been talking, I want to make a change. So you'll never know what I had lined up. She'll just, annoy everybody. Like, what was it? So I was thinking about what, Jens's response to when do you come up with your best idea? And then this thought also of acknowledging where your ideas come from. So I think that after this conversation, my challenge should be about thinking when you last had a great idea, and not just how you had it, but actually what was the stimulus for that? And was there other people involved in that stimulus? And if there were, to go and tell them. And even if what you've actually done, your action has changed quite radically from what they said, if there was a stimulus in there, go and let them know. And I think that probably is a big challenge to many people, to actually go and let people know that. And even to just pick back in your own mind what really was the stimulus for the last idea I had. Because it wasn't one thing. It wasn't 5 minutes before you took the action. It's going to be a long time. So a bit of deep thinking into that, and then really go and acknowledge it with some people. I think that would be beautiful if we could all start doing that.
Love that. It's a really good one.
You can see, Eleanor, with that challenge, you've already got Jens thinking, and I'm sure that it ties so well, and why I love that and how you handled that on the fly as well, because it ties exactly what we spoke about today, and it also ties into that concept of making space to do the learning, to do the thinking. And I think sometimes in this world of instant gratification, whether you're an experienced thinker or a young thinker, and that example of the 8-year-olds meeting the 70-year-olds, both of them interacted and interpreted the space that they needed for that interaction completely differently. And as soon as you change some of those factors or those influencing environments, the way that we learn can change so significantly. So I know that I've definitely got some deep thinking to do around the challenge that you've set for us. So thank you again so much for your time and the concepts and the thinking that you shared with us. And like I said, we'll hopefully have to have you back sometime to dive a little deeper on a lot of the concepts that you put down. And Jens, thanks for your time as always. It's great to have recorded another episode with you.
Yeah, thank you all. It's been wonderful to be here, and I'd absolutely love to come back.
Yeah, thank you both as well. Great. See you next time.
Thanks for listening and joining us on the journey that is the Reverse Mental Lab. If anything fascinated you in the discussion that we had today, you're welcome to set up a 15-minute coffee chat with us. Our emails are in the show notes, and you can also connect with us on our website, thexyzplayground.com.